In the last episode of The Time Compass,
You see, in ancient India, accepting the destiny that was drawn out for you before you were born was like accepting the laws of nature. Fighting your destiny meant losing the opportunity to be reborn as something better in the next life. A caste was a way of organizing people, giving them a place in society from the time they were born. Each child belonged to the caste in which they were born, and they usually had to fulfill this role for the rest of their lives.
The Time Compass. India, Part 2. The caste system that existed in India was very strict. If you were born in a caste, you usually stayed there. And people in lower castes had much harder lives than those above. So why did the Indian people believe that people could suffer such different destinies based only on what family a child was born into? The reason was that, to Indian people, life isn't something that just happens once. When a person died, the belief was that they came back to live a new life. And when they died in that life, they were reincarnated again into the next life. And when that person died, well, you get the idea. Each time, their soul was born again in a new body to live a new life, and the cycle continued. But who and what they were reborn as followed the law of karma. A person's karma is sort of like carrying a backpack around with a person's soul. Each time the person did something bad, it was like placing heavy rocks in the bag. Every action a person did in their life had a consequence. At the end of life, when it was time to make the journey of reincarnation, all the bad things a person did would weigh their soul down, and they would be dragged down the ladder of the caste system, forced to live a harder life the next time around. If you were really bad, you were reborn as an animal, or worst of all, to be born as a Dalit. People so low on the ladder, they didn't even belong to a caste. But if the person was good throughout their life, then they might have a chance for something better in the life after that. The Path to Enlightenment.
In the year 563 BC, a man brought a new perspective to things in India. And his ideas helped many people who were suffering under the caste system. This man was called Siddhartha Gautama, but in time, he came to be known as Buddha. The young Siddhartha was the main heir to a small kingdom. His father loved him greatly and did not want him to know suffering. The young prince was isolated in a wonderful palace, surrounded by various pleasures, servants, and delightful music. In this way, his father tried to hide aging, sickness, and death from him. But Siddhartha suspected that there was more to life than his luxurious prison. And since he was a restless young man, he began to leave the palace to see his subjects. The first time that he went forth, he saw an old, stooped man. Another time, he saw a sick man. And on another occasion, he saw a dead man. Siddhartha was dismayed. He didn't know about the suffering people had to endure in the real world. He decided not to return to his life of fantasy. Instead, he abandoned all his wealth to meditate on the suffering of people in the world. Siddhartha went deep into the woods and lived without a home. He shaved his head and wore nothing but rags. Siddhartha practiced something called meditation. Using the power of his mind, he slowed down his breathing, only ate a tiny bit of food, and could remain virtually motionless for hours or even days. He meditated to learn the mysteries of the universe. He spent years meditating, eventually learning to meditate more deeply than any other man. One day, something happened. It was like a great light turned on in his soul. Siddhartha left to tell his people of his great discovery. From that day on, he was known as Buddha, which means the Enlightened One. All suffering is born from the desire to acquire something. If we manage to stop desiring, we will also stop suffering. Buddha taught that by controlling one's desires, a person could become their own master, so that when one dies, one will no longer need to be reborn as something else, and one's soul will reach nirvana, where suffering and ailments do not exist. This means a person's soul could remain in a state of peace forever. Ashoka and the spread of Buddhism. In the 5th century BC, India fell to the hands of foreign invaders. First, it was the Persians under the command of Cyrus I. And 200 years later, in the year 327 BC, the Greeks under Alexander the Great set out to conquer them. Chandragupta was the first Indian king to take back all the occupied territories and to make most of what we know as modern-day India one great empire. But it was his grandson, Ashoka, who would be even more important in bringing a new life to his country. But the story of this new life starts with the story of death. In roughly the 9th year of his reign, his army conquered the kingdom of Kalinga. It was a brutal and bloody war, and many people on both sides died. Ashoka realized how terrible this violence had been. He converted to Buddhism, and instead of continuing to shed blood, he dedicated his reign to spreading peace and tolerance throughout the region. Many works were carried out to improve the conditions of his people. From shady places to rest and wells of water to refresh oneself on hot days, to hospitals where the qualities of plants to cure diseases were studied. Ashoka spent much of his wealth replacing broken and burnt structures with temples to teach the lessons of Buddha and making his kingdom into a peaceful place. Because of this, Ashoka became one of the most famous kings of ancient India and is remembered with great respect today. The legacy of Islam. Roughly 400 years after the magnificent period of Ashoka's reign, India stopped being a single empire and became fragmented into many independent kingdoms. Each of these small kingdoms was ruled by a Maharaja, which means great or high king. As early as the 7th century, Muslims arrived in India and began to spread the religion of Islam. Much later, in the 13th century, Turkic and then Mongol warriors came from the steppes of Asia and took control of the whole country.
Wow! So everybody wanted to control India?
That's true, Pipo. But because of the influences of all these different peoples, Indian culture was enriched with thousands of nuances, stories, and traditions, becoming one of the richest cultures in the world. One of the most famous symbols of Indian culture is the Taj Mahal, which may seem like a palace, but in reality, it is a tomb. Possibly the most famous tomb in the world. The story goes that in the 15th century, there lived in the city of Agra a Muslim emperor of Turkic-Mongol origin named Shah Jahan. He had many wives, but his favorite of all was Mumtaz Mahal. He loved her with all his heart. When she died in 1631, the emperor was heartbroken and dedicated much of his life to building an incredibly beautiful mausoleum for her. To this day, the Taj Mahal stands as one of the most beautiful buildings ever built, a magnificent symbol of love. Let's dig a little deeper with our time compass and find out about other influential women throughout history. Many women in ancient Egypt were very influential, and some of them even became pharaohs. In the mid-15th century BC, Hatshepsut was a pharaoh who ruled Egypt longer than any other woman, for over 20 years. 100 years later, in 1370 BC, another woman would hold power in Egypt. Her name was Nefertiti, which means the beautiful one has arrived. Her famed beauty has been immortalized in hundreds of paintings and sculptures of the age. Nefertiti was the great royal wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who prohibited the worshipping of all gods except one, the sun god Aten. Akhenaten and Nefertiti together built a new city from which they governed as equals, something which had never been done before or since in ancient Egypt. Some scholars also think that Nefertiti ruled as pharaoh after the death of Akhenaten under a different name. And let's not forget the legendary pharaoh Cleopatra, who in the 1st century BC held the most powerful men of that time in the palm of her hand. First, she conquered the heart of Julius Caesar, thus guaranteeing herself the protection of Rome. But when Caesar was assassinated, Cleopatra formed an alliance and fell in love with a Roman general named Mark Antony. Together, they formed an alliance between Egypt and Rome, but lost control of Rome to Caesar's heir Octavian at the Battle of Actium. It ended tragically, but the tale of Antony and Cleopatra is still remembered as one of the greatest love stories of all time.